Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential, Senate, and gubernatorial elections and analyzing the best case scenario for Republicans. Obviously, last video I did the same thing, but for the Democrats, the best Joe Biden can do, the best Democrats can do in the Senate races and the governor races, and today I'll be looking at the same outcome just on the other end for Republicans. So, pretty self-explanatory topic, I would say. Let's just get right into it here by filling out the safe states for Donald Trump. These are going to mostly be the states he won back in 2020 with a few exceptions here. Obviously, I think Kansas would be safe. Alaska, too. Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana. We'll add Ohio to that category as well as South Carolina and Maine's 2nd Congressional District. So, at best, Donald Trump starts out with 149 safe electoral votes. Joe Biden, for his states, he'd still win a couple of states by these safe margins here. Just going to kind of fill them out as we go. He'd be at 130, or 133 actually. And then to get into our likely Republican states, I think we'd start off with a couple more competitive states from 2020, the first being Texas. Obviously, Texas in 2020 did vote for Trump by around 5.5. In this scenario, maybe he'd win it by 7 or 8. It's a left-trending state, so it's kind of a cap on how well Donald Trump can do here. But that being said, it's still possible that we could see some rightward trends here. It would, in this scenario, he'd mostly kind of really accelerate the trends in the South that are favorable to Republicans while holding his own in the suburbs. Again, not very likely, but in a best-case scenario, that would be what would happen. Florida's pretty self-explanatory. He won it by 3 in 2020. It's a right-trending state. Maybe he won it by 10 in this scenario. Then North Carolina. North Carolina would likely be a likely Republican state just as a result of a decrease in black turnout for Joe Biden, and that would really hurt Democrats statewide, and it would affect the percentage of the vote they would get. Obviously, with any level of decrease in the black turnout, specifically among Democrats in North Carolina, that would cause them to lose the state, but the more dramatic the increase, the smaller or the bigger the GOP margin of victory would be. And I think in this scenario, we'd also see Democrats really collapsing in the suburbs and not keeping up their gains. And that would be what would give Donald Trump a 5-point victory in North Carolina statewide. And then that would be it for our likely Republican states. Joe Biden would still have a couple likely states. I think Oregon and Colorado would be the two here. Again, in 2020, these states are both decided by, I think, 13 or 14 points for Joe. I think Oregon's actually 16 points. Colorado was 14. But let's say they both swing a little bit towards Trump. These are both pretty left-trending states. I don't think there's a ton of room for Trump to grow here. But best case scenario, maybe we see the suburbs kind of stay stagnant and Trump improve in urban and rural areas. Illinois would also be there, not competitive, but decrease in Chicago turnout plus more Republican gains in the rural areas would kind of get that margin to below 15. And then we'd see some of the states on the coast here, like Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island. These are all states that in 2020 were, except for Virginia, they were all safe for Joe Biden. Just decreases in margins from these northeastern states. Then Virginia just kind of narrowing out to be a 6 or 7 point margin for Joe Biden. That would be the best case scenario for Trump. But now these remaining states, these are the most competitive states we're looking at. So Trump at 235, Biden at 204. For Trump, we're going to start out with Nevada and Arizona. These are both states that I think in a best case scenario for him would tilt or lean towards him rather. Again, very competitive, but Republicans have won these states recently. In Nevada, they did well in some races in the midterms. Then in Arizona, Trump won it in 2016. Republicans did win a couple races there last year, although not the major ones. So, yes, these are both states that are tilting Democrat in a normal scenario, but in a best case, the swing states always go to the party in the best case scenario. Georgia's a similar thing. Georgia, like Arizona, it's trending to the left pretty rapidly, but Donald Trump, if he can make the suburbs stagnate, if he could kind of replicate the performance of Brian Kemp to an extent in those areas, and then hope for a decrease in turnout from the city of Atlanta and hope for more Republican gains in the rural areas, that's why he'd win Georgia by maybe 3 or 4. And then the Rust Belt. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these two states would be crucial to Trump in this scenario. And again, I think we could see Trump win these states in the best case scenario by maybe 3 or 4, mostly due to gains with working class voters and better margins and decreased Democratic margins in cities like Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. Then to kind of round out the map here, I think Trump could win Michigan and New Hampshire very narrowly. Again, New Hampshire was only decided by 2,000 votes in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. So in theory, Trump could win it. Obviously, that's not what I actually think is going to happen. But in the best case scenario for the Republicans, Biden maybe really has bad debate performances. The economy gets significantly worse, and Democrats lose support nationwide. New Hampshire would probably be on the flip list. And then Michigan. Trump won it in 2016. So best case scenario, I think he could do it again, but it would be very narrow. There'd be a very slim path for it. But that being said, I do think, aside from Nebraska's 2nd district, I think Biden would carry the rest of these states. I think he'd win Minnesota by maybe just under a point. He'd win New Mexico, and he'd win Maine, the at-large vote there. So that's kind of where I'd be at in terms of how Joe Biden would do. New Mexico and Minnesota, I think, just for now, are just not there for Republicans. Obviously, Trump could do well in the rural areas and maybe improve in the suburbs of Minneapolis, but still, that's not enough to get him to victory. He'd have to do something else significantly better than he did in 2016, where he actually came within 2 points of winning Minnesota in 2016. But again, that was an entirely different scenario. So maybe he would do that well in a best case scenario in 2024, but he wouldn't be able to win it. So essentially, this map is kind of just the 2016 map, but giving Trump New Hampshire. And I think that's a fair assessment of where the GOP would be in a best case scenario. Again, Maine. I mean, I guess you could give it to Trump just narrowly here, just to kind of be interesting. But again, the interesting thing for Republicans is that they really don't have that big of a ceiling nationwide. Maybe they can come close to winning New Mexico or Minnesota, but realistically speaking, nationwide, I do think that Democrats have a larger ceiling. That being said, in a best-case scenario for Donald Trump, it'd still be very decisive. He'd still win almost every swing state on the board here, and that would be huge for him. And for Republicans in the Senate, it would be really strong. So they'd win Utah, Wyoming, both seats in Nebraska, North Dakota, Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, West Virginia, Indiana. And I'd say the first state that I get out of the way is Florida with Rick Scott. He'd probably win by maybe double digits. DeSantis and Rubio in the Senate race in 2022, he won by 17. And then Rick Scott, I don't think he'd win by that much, but I do think he'd be able to win by maybe 12 in the best case scenario for Republicans. And then we'd also see kind of an early flip here. Ohio, Sherrod Brown would go down there. Sherrod Brown won by 7 in 2018. And again, he overperformed Richard Cordray by 11. But this is the thing that Democrats are really worried about in Ohio. Brown outperformed Cordray by 11, but the Republicans really didn't fund Jim Renacci, who was his opponent. So that 11-point overperformance is impressive, but not like world beating when you consider the fact that the Republicans gave up on his opponent 4 months out from the election. So if Republicans fund whoever, whether it be LaRose or Moreno or Dolan, whoever the Republicans run against him, they're certainly going to fund whoever they run. And in addition to that, if in this scenario Trump's winning Ohio by 14 or 15 and Brown only outruns by 7, it could get really bad for Democrats in Ohio. And that would be the best case scenario for Republicans in Sherrod Brown's seat. That being said, there would still be some races that Democrats would win. Washington, California, Hawaii, New Mexico and Minnesota would be reduced margins, but they'd still be for Democrats. With Virginia, they'd still win Maryland, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and even Maine with Angus King. I just want to get that one out of the way. I think it would be a lean Democratic race, but Angus King has historically outperformed, and I think he would do well again, even in a best-case scenario for Republicans. But beyond that, it gets pretty bad for Democrats here. Nevada, Arizona, I'd say Nevada would be a bit harder for Republicans because Jim Marchin's just such a bad candidate, although, again, he could absolutely win in a best-case scenario for Republicans. But in Arizona, the best-case scenario for Republicans would be Gallego running for Democrats, which is going to happen, obviously, and whether it be Lake or Masters or even Mark Lamb, who's, I think, a sheriff, who I don't think is that better than Lake or Masters. But either way, Republicans are going to run a bad candidate no matter what. But they can still win if Sinema stays in the race and runs a campaign that takes away more votes from Gallego. And that would create a scenario in which Democrats would lose Arizona by vote split. And that obviously would be great for Republicans. They'd also win Montana and Texas, I would say, by likely margins in this scenario. If Trump's winning Texas by 7, like I said, Cruz is probably winning by 6. And if in Montana, this is a safe state for Republicans no matter what. Tester's an overperformer. He'll overperform by a lot again. But Will it be by enough? In this scenario, absolutely not. Tim Sheehy, who would be the GOP nominee in this world we've derived, would likely unseat Jon Tester by 5 or 6 points. We'd see a collapse in support for Tester with voters who have supported him in the past. Because again, Tester, in 2018, he won because he was able to get a lot of Republican voters on board with him. They voted for him in 2018. And historically, when you see these longtime incumbents in red states lose, or red areas, red districts, if you want to be specific, lose, it goes down quickly. In Minnesota, Colin Peterson won in 2016 and 2018, but in 2020, he lost by 15 re-election. He'd won a good victory 2 years prior, and then just like that, he lost by 15 because that support all went away. It didn't gradually decline. It just, with this, snap of your fingers, it went away. In Montana, if that happened to Jon Tester, we'd see all his Republican crossover support just go away. He'd lose by a lot, by a likely margin. And then the states that would be lean for Democrats that I would want to add in here would be Delaware would be likely, but New Jersey I think would be lean for Menendez. He'd win by 5. And that's just I guess you could put it in likely, but that's mostly just because in 2018 he only won by 10. He's a very bad incumbent, and he has a lot of downside for Democrats. But in the Rust Belt, Bob Casey would still hold on, maybe 2 or 3 points, but Democrats would lose in Wisconsin and Michigan. And that would be very bad for them, obviously, because they'd be at 44 Senate seats. GOP would be at 56. But again, it's important to look at these races. In 2018, all 3 of these Senate seats were pretty decisively for Democrats. The closest was Michigan, which was a 7-point margin for Debbie Stabenow. But again, still pretty decisive. In Wisconsin, the path for a GOP victory would be nominating Tom Tiffany over David Clark and unseating Tammy Baldwin very narrowly just by running it up in the suburbs of specifically Waukesha County, and then getting, like I said with Tester, a lot of Democrats who last won in 2018 by good margins, they got a lot of crossover support from Republican voters. If that all evaporates in Wisconsin, Baldwin could lose. In Michigan, you look at this, it's an open seat for the Democratic Party here with Stabenow retiring. They're likely to run Eliza Slotkin. And Republicans, if they run James Craig, who I think would be a decent candidate, and he can do better, maybe say in an area like Detroit, or potentially we see decreased Democratic turnout, those two things would be really helpful for Republicans. And then Craig doing well in the suburbs against someone like Slotkin, who's not really a person I think has great appeal to the suburbs. Again, in a normal scenario, I think she'd do fine, but in a worst case scenario in which everything goes wrong for Democrats, she would lose this a lot of votes in the suburbs. We'd see Michigan vote for Republicans by just under a point. And then Pennsylvania, it would stay blue, but it would be by a very close margin, only by 2 or 3 points. In case he won by 13 in 2018, that would be very embarrassing for him to only win by 2 or 3 points. So this is the best case scenario for Republicans in the Senate. 56 Senate seats there to kind of go with Trump's 319 electoral votes. Governor's map is a bit less interesting here. In Washington, I think it will be reduced to a likely margin for whoever the Democrats run there. Jay Inslee's obviously not running for re-election. Delaware, similar thing, just kind of a margin thing would be reduced to a likely margin. Republicans would hold on to all their seats by safe margins. New Hampshire, if Sununu ran for re-election. And then North Carolina, Mark Robinson would win by maybe 2%. He'd still underperform Trump by a lot, but obviously he could win in the best case scenario. It would take Josh Stein running a bad campaign. It would take voters in the suburbs kind of tilting towards Robinson as they did in his lieutenant governor bid. And that would give Republicans 9 of these 11 governorships up in 2024. It would give them 56 Senate seats, would be a huge margin, and it would give Donald Trump 319 electoral votes. So this is the scenario, the absolute best case scenario for Republicans. Obviously not likely to happen, but fun to explore these scenarios because, again, they do kind of show you the most extreme outcome that could possibly happen on either end. So if you enjoyed that video, let me know what you think. Comment down below what you want to see next, and I'll see you all in the next video.